This week on The Futurists.
When I think about the future, I think, well, what are the things that are inevitable? And then a quite different question is, how long will it take? And I think it's absolutely inevitable that, yes, we will interact significantly in virtual spaces, and particularly using avatar-based technologies that are potentially as close to who we are as echoing, essentially replicating ourselves in a virtual world down to skin pores and so on.
Hi, I'm Brett King, and with me on The Futurists is Robert Tercek, and together we examine the thought leaders, the engineers, the forecasters, the futurist sci-fi authors building and thinking about the future every day. This week, we have world-renowned futurist, keynote speaker, entrepreneur, and author, Ross Dawson, a fellow Aussie futurist, which is always good to support the Australian view of the future. Ross Dawson, welcome to The Futurist.
Awesome to be on the show. Thanks.
Good to have you here, Ross.
Yeah, I know. I'm not sure exactly when this show will air, but it is topical. How do you feel about the election result that occurred over the weekend?
Well, I'm not a fan of two-party systems.
Yeah,
and we kind of put paid to that in Australia quite effectively over the last couple of days. This I think points to if we're talking about the future, that two-party, a future of democracy is a pretty important part of our future as a human race, and two-party politics is broken. And, I go on for this for a long time as to why, but it just essentially means you've got two camps all fighting against each other, all opposing each other, and so being able to get a whole stack of independents and other parties and so on to play with that. I mean, it may make it a little less easy to govern, but as in many of the Northern Western Europe countries, they've certainly done coalition politics in an effective manner. And I think, let's death of two-party politics. Thumbs up for that.
No, consensus building, is hard when you've got only two sides, and it tends to be polarized like that. So. But maybe we start with this, Ross. We've known each other for many years now. In fact, we met through the futurist community online. But you've been in this game for a while. You previously had experience in like stockbrokering and other things. You've run your own businesses. But what made you go down the path of becoming a futurist?
Well, when I was young, I mean, I don't remember the exact date, but certainly while I was still at university, so 20 or something like that, I was thinking about, well, what do I do with my life? I'd chosen to do a degree.
You were thinking about your future.
Well, I was, but I'd only just started because I did a degree in physics because I thought, well, I have no idea what I want to do. I'll just do something which I think is interesting. And I had no intention of becoming a physicist, but I thought physics, this understands the nature of the world we live in. And then I began to think while I was there, all right, well, this will be over and I want to get out in the real world. And I thought, wow, wouldn't it be amazing to be a futurologist, which was the term at the time. And so that was, and the other thing was just think tanks, I suppose, I just wanted to think for a living, think about the world, think about society, think about where things were going. And I had most of my corporate career was a bit stultifying. Well, that's probably a bit cruel, but I mean, I learned a lot, but it just wasn't, it was a path that was trying to get me somewhere. And when I finally left corporate world, and I had got some great experience on the way, the first thought was, well, yes, this is what I want to do. And in the first year, I started doing scenario planning program, which was run by Global Business Network, and did my advanced scenario training in San Francisco and started doing that. And that's 25 years ago now. But it was still, I wasn't a futurist because that wasn't most of my work. So when most people say, how do you become a futurist?
late 20th century.
That's right, last century. So when people say, how do you become a futurist? I usually say, well, you claim you are, and people either believe you or they don't. And what that means, you need to become credible first. And so, there's plenty of people claiming they're futurists, far too many. But I said, okay, well, I need to build my credibility. My first couple of books in particular started to pave the way. The first one, the subtitle was The Future of Professional Services. And over 20 years later, I think it's borne out. And my second one was Living Networks, which again is sort of, I think, come to pass. But it was still another few years. And I set up Future Exploration Network in 2006. And we launched the Future of Media Summit, which was held simultaneously in Sydney and San Francisco. So there was that was a time when I had built my own futurist organization. We were doing work all over the world. It was that was the time I was finally a full-time futurist.
When you first set up the cross-Pacific collaboration, that was where I think we crossed paths, or where I first became got in contact with you. And at the time, I mean, that was a long time ago. That was about 15 years ago.
2006 was the first one, yeah.
That's right. So this is, just to put in perspective for people who are listening, that's before YouTube. It's before streaming video was a thing. And Ross was already finding ways to patch people together, transatlantic or transpacific, I guess, at that point, for real-time conversations, and was unlocking the power of collaborative forecasting or collaborative scenario planning. And that's really important, I think, because right now, of course, we're doing this call on Zoom. Everybody post-pandemic is quite comfortable with talking, in real time to people on other sides of the world. That just wasn't the case back then. So in a way, in order for you to gather the viewpoints of different people from around the world, you had to invent a little piece of the future. You had to invent a little technology that enabled real-time collaboration. Talk a little bit about that.
So I wanted to, I have a foot in San Francisco. Well, many places around the world, San Francisco in particular, for a long time. And there were had a good community of people there. And so I was running this event to kick off Future Exploration Network, Future Media Summit. I thought, well, most of the really interesting people I know are a long way away. Well, let's build them into the conversation. So we had to find a sponsor to sponsor the teleconference piece of it, and did that for the first few years until we sort of worked out our own ways of doing it. But it was really this, and it was very interesting, the dynamics of that, in terms of saying, all right, well, how do we actually build a conversation between places in two continents? So we literally had a panel with people on one side and people on the other side. And I suppose
was it video or was it just audio?
No, it was video. And
That's
so
really quite impressive.
So what you have to do is on the panel, you're sitting on the panel, and then next to you is a screen. So it has to be kind of a little bit V-shaped. So it's like you can turn and you can look at the people on the panel who are on the other continent. And then you've got the moderator. And so you've got essentially, people sitting on a stage, standing next to them a screen. So the audience can see both the people on both, the physical people and the distant people, and the people on the panel can see their counterparts. So
basically every problem that event planners around the world had to encounter during the pandemic, you solved about 15 years before them.
Well, we made it work. The first one event, I actually thought, so I got a colleague who did the San Francisco side, said, well, actually, this didn't work quite as well as I wanted on the San Francisco side. So I actually spent every event after that, I flew over to San Francisco and moderated on that side. Worked out, basically, you have to have two people on each side, more than two on each side, and it just becomes difficult. You've got time lags and so on. And I moderated. I just felt I wasn't able to delegate. I had brought in some moderators for some of them, and they didn't get the subtleties of cross-continental panel moderation.
Do you think? I know we're jumping right in here, but with the advances we've seen around Zoom and so forth, obviously, the pandemic has shifted a lot of this. Where we even as speakers, the three of us are in that space where we've got more used to doing virtual. Obviously, going to physical events is still something that I prefer to do. But where do you think, or how quickly do you think the metaverse will create spaces for us to do these types of events and collaboration?
Well, how quickly is the important question. So when I think about the future, I think, well, what are the things that are inevitable? And then a quite different question is, how long will it take? And I think it's absolutely inevitable that, yes, we will interact significantly in virtual spaces, and particularly using avatar-based technologies that are very, well, potentially as close to who we are exactly, essentially replicating ourselves in a virtual world down to skin pores and so on. So the timeline for that, I think, is very uncertain. But we will move more and more on that. I'm very interested as well in things like the 3D or quasi 3D or quasi holographic or holographic and other ways of bringing us beyond a flat screen. And, they're getting some pretty decent advances in that. I think that some of that will progress apace. But the metaverse, I think, is going to be more and more engaged. But part of it, I think, is also that what it will take for people to feel comfortable to be in an event, for example, in the metaverse, as opposed to what they're used to on a screen or going to a physical event.
And how much friction there is around setting each of those things up. Because right now, the vision, at least as I'm seeing it, it's pretty early for the metaverse. But the way I'm seeing it right now is each company seems to be pursuing their own separate version of the metaverse, which is going to kind of feel like another social network. And frankly, who the hell wants to go through the process of logging in, setting up a profile, connecting with your friend, all of that stuff? Can't we just have like a universal login? I'm excited by a company called Ready Player Me because they're developing a standard where you can build an avatar that represents yourself, and then it's transportable from as long as the different metaverses subscribe to the same standard. You'll be able to import that, so you don't have to like go through the hassle of replicating. And what that'll do is it'll increase sampling, right? It'll increase the ability for people to graze across multiple worlds. What we're drifting towards in this conversation, it seems like, is the way the Web 2 companies have built all these switching costs into their platforms. They make it very difficult for you to graze from one platform to another. And then that makes it difficult to commingle communities. And I think what now that people have spent, the good 10, 15 years developing a social presence and developing a virtual identity, and we've all become adept in developing digital ways of representing ourselves, whether it's a website or Twitter or social media or anything else. Now I think people have a different expectation of what they want from a platform. We couldn't say what that was in 2006. We didn't know. But now we've all lived through it, and we can say, actually, here's what we definitely don't want. Here's what we definitely do want. I think that's actually kind of an exciting future. It's like the audience has matured somewhat. We weren't very good at social media in 2010 because most of us were new to it.
Whatever happened to universal messaging too, right? That was supposed to be a thing, right? Where you were going to bring in all of your different messaging, emails and SMS and, social media into one platform. That sort of disappeared or died a death as well.
But platforms don't like it. Even now, Apple's putting wedges into just plain text messaging, right? So if you have, if you're texting with somebody who has an iPhone, you get one experience. If you're texting with somebody on Android, you get a slightly degraded experience, and they sort of shame you by putting it in a green bubble and so forth. It's old school. Like we're tired of this approach, I think.
Well, this is partly where I started a lot of these things in social media. So Living Networks, which I wrote in 2002, is largely about the emergence of social networks, and fundamental to it was the interoperability. That was one of the premises on which my idea of the Living Networks was based. So early on in social media, I was involved. In fact, I was on the advisory committee for the APML, the Attention Profile Markup Language, which was essentially being able to take transportable data and to build that. And a lot of what I wrote on my blog back, this 15 years or so ago was about these issues of how we could transcend the walled gardens of social media to be able to move to that. And I've been following that for all the time. And it's been pretty disappointing all along the way. And in a way, they've got more entrenched with how powerful each of those players are.
Yeah.
So now, as you suggest, Robert, I think, it is the degree of our, user demand, where we said we expect we must have this ability to interoperate. And the fact that, that being actually driving the success of these platforms or otherwise, because it's going to be a brutal battle to play out. This is the massive prize. Yeah, and so if we see that those platforms that offer a greater degree of interoperability are favored by users because they feel this way now, having been battered for so long, then that's promising.
I've been talking about data colonialism and AI imperialism in the sense that data assets are extracted from audiences all over the world. but they're typically concentrated in companies that are based in California or in Beijing. And so they're being centralized. And then what comes back to the colonized, if you will, we go with the metaphor, is AI that makes decisions about what you get to see and what you get to choose. And so a limited set of choices comes back to you. And this is starting to resonate. I think what's going to emerge, my prediction, and it's something I'm working towards my own work, is a digital bill of rights. Some sort of demand from the people who participate in these worlds. Hey, if you want us to help build out these new imaginary immersive worlds, we're ready to do it. We're ready to participate, but we're going to do that on our terms. We'll see how far we get with that. There's this sort of long pendulum swing on the internet between highly decentralized, ad hoc, work that's done by different individuals in large numbers, and then centralization on the other side. And of course, we're in a phase of supremely concentrated centralization.
But also movements of decentralization, including what Twitter used to moot, and Jack Dorsey, and of course now we inject the blockchain type elements where there's more and more of the potential. And so you've talked on the Futurists before about distributed autonomous organizations, and I think it's very hard at this point for a DAO to establish a massive market share in social platforms, but there will be more alternatives. There are already alternatives where we can start to see distributed rights, where essentially everyone can own and control with a high degree of granularity their information, how it's shared, the interactions and so on. And this is absolutely a very compelling vision of where it could go. But we still need
largely vision at this stage. Largely,
But, there's some debate going on right now, obviously, around health data as an example. I think there is elements of efficiency to centralizing data networks in respect to like health services, as an example. Genomics, blood work, real-time biometrics, and so forth. I actually think, having that all centralized at a national level would provide you the ability to be far more efficient and better at resource management in terms of provision of healthcare than keeping it in lots of different separate companies, for example. But you could have an element of decentralization, like we have the concept of open banking with financial services, where you make certain elements of that data available to the decentralized world to massage and innovate health tech around that. I think there's there's an argument where you could have in these worlds of the future a bit of a hybrid in terms of that centralized and decentralized.
Yes, and you necessarily need that, particularly in terms of health data. And I think health data it's really pointed because, and this shows up the privacy versus common value debate. If we're looking at sharing DNA data, because potentially, if we were able to correlate individual genetic data with everything from all of your behaviors, all of your your diseases, everything that goes wrong, goes right, then we could have an extraordinary database. But this would require everybody to expose all of their genetic data with, fraud implications, and potential for abuse of this. So I think this is a real way in which we can, when in mapping some of these future paths forward, there is massive common value in sharing data, and where possible, being able to give individuals that control, to control that data. But there are also issues because we've always seen that these things have been abused, and genetic data is one of those things that can be.
Well, and let's also point out that most people don't want the hassle of managing this stuff, right? We would prefer, instead of setting up an email server, we'd prefer to get the free email from Google, even if it means Google gets to read every single one of our emails. We all seem to have gotten pretty comfortable with that. And while I'm not proposing radical transparency or, the radical release of personal data, I'd love to actually, have a bit more control over that. I'm realistic about the fact that most people just can't be bothered. We have not done a good job as technologists of conveying the value of maintaining your personal data, which includes your behavior, your location, your preferences, your interests, your browsing activity, all your communications, who your friends are, what they're interested in. I mean, like the list goes on and on. The amount of things that are being tracked is actually quite extraordinary. Most people are blissfully unaware of it. And when you point it out to them, they're outraged for a moment, but then when they go right back to their Gmail and their instant messaging account and their social media accounts that are managed by a centralized system. So there's a certain amount of user lassitude or inertia that would have to be overcome for a truly decentralized approach to gain a lot of traction.
Yes.
Ross, is, looking at your career as a futurist, futurologist, is there anything that's really surprised you in terms of developments that have happened that you thought might take a different path?
Well, the first thing that springs to mind is how social media and sharing has gone not as well as we initially hoped.
Yeah.
I think there's many of us, I was one of the massive evangelists from the start, saying, the potential for connection. And, there were a lot of very powerful benefits initially, and that has been perverted and subverted. It doesn't mean we can't come out the other side. So these are all of great value, but that's, the sort of the first thing that springs to mind. And, I am an optimist. And so, this is, that's quite a deliberate stance. And it's been found that there have been some, things that have happening which have, wouldn't say shaken that, because, I still think we can be optimists. But in terms of the political developments globally, fractures. And so I suppose if we're looking from a scenario perspective, one of the key dimensions between coherence and fragmentation, I suppose it's not so much a surprise per se, but, I suppose alarming is this massive fragmentation or polarization, which we're seeing across borders on all sides. And I suppose that's certainly something I haven't, I've been looking at for a long time, but at a certain point, it was started to become something had to become more aware of.
And you're talking about the polarization of the electorate and domestic politics.
Not only. So for me, polarization goes across politics, the wealth against access, around education, around attitudes to privacy, around attitudes to openness, the whole wealth of different domains. And a lot of these ends up as social fragmentation. Essentially this is dividing populations in various ways, but it is not just political.
Well, I think what we should probably do now is roll into a break. Folks, you're listening to The Futurists with Brett King and me, Rob Tercek. And this week, our guest is Ross Dawson, the futurist from Australia. He's a keynote speaker, a noted author, and he's been a futurologist for more than 20 years. And we've just been going through a little bit of that history. We're going to take a short break. We'll be back in a minute. So please stay tuned to The Futurists.
Welcome to Breaking Banks, the #1 global fintech radio show and podcast. I'm Brett King.
And I'm Jason Henricks. Every week since 2013, we explore the personalities, startups, innovators, and industry players driving disruption in financial services.
From incumbents to unicorns, and from cutting-edge technology to the people using it to help create a more innovative, inclusive, and healthy financial future. I'm JP Nichols, and this is Breaking Banks.
Hey, you're listening to The Futurists, and we're back. It's Rob Tercek with my co-host, Brett King, and this week we're interviewing Ross Dawson, a futurist from Australia. And one of the things that's on my mind is, hey, I'm getting double teamed here by two Australian futurists this
No
week.
worries, mate.
What's the story? What is it about Australia that makes you so interested in the future?
Well, I mean, I'm maybe a little bit of a different case, as I've lived a very large chunk, including almost all my childhood overseas. So I'm not a typical Australian. Don't have a very Australian accent.
Yeah, I can't claim to be a typical Aussie either.
Well, but that's part of it.
That's
Hang on,
true.
hang on. But every Australian I know travels like mad. Like Australians have no problem. If you go, well, it's a 24-hour flight. They're like, yeah, no problem. And then where? You know, like everywhere you go, you run into Australian backpackers. So that seems like
that is part of it. I think this desire to explore.
Yeah.
And so Australians are very. If you look at the Association of Professional Futurists and the board and so on, there are Australians are vastly represented relative to our population. There's a lot of Australians, a lot of Australian courses, sort of tertiary courses and so on. So,
right, there's a lot of Australian interest in the future, but it's not a particularly futuristic country, is it?
Well, I think that the politics has rarely been very future-oriented, save for a few politicians here or there who tried to do something.
The last
immediately
one
batted down with
Keating,
big sticks.
Right? Yeah.
There's a little bit of a pendulum swing. You make a step forward and a step back. But what I've noticed, I've been to Australia a lot in the last 20 years. And what I've noticed is that there's two of everything. You know, there's like two major retail companies. There's two major sportswear companies. There's two telcos, for instance. And it's because in a country with a population smaller than that of California, how many businesses can you sustain? And then the main business of Australia is selling, bits of the country by the shovelful.
Exactly.
China
has been, certainly.
So in a way, that's
there was a great economist. I can't remember his name right now, but he said Australia's a third world country with a lot of natural resources, right? The point being that the Australian economy was fairly dependent on those natural resources. If you take that out of the economy looks very, very different. And I think that's one of the most frustrating elements in respect to what you're saying, Rob, or the question about being future focused. Like, Australia is the perfect country for developing solar technology. Right, Australia is the perfect country for looking at, renovation of the ocean. In respect to plastics and bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef and so forth. There's so many areas where Australia would do well domestically, and internationally, competitively, to develop future-focused technologies. But
it has done fairly well on particularly the solar energy technologies. Australia's universities are in the vanguard. A lot of it has been the issues with commercialization,
right?
And the economy is in a transition phase now with more and more people who do things like watch the rich list, see how the technology, young technologists are getting a pretty decent chunk of the list and so on.
But in terms of high technology, there's like two examples of Australian companies that have been successful, I think, Atlassian and Canva, right? Two companies based in Australia that have kind of broken out into the world stage. Where if you take a country like, say, Finland or Israel or even the Netherlands, when it comes to TV formats, these countries with significantly smaller populations, 5 or 6 million, their entire economy is geared for export. Like everything they develop, they use the domestic territory as just a beta test or a launch, a proof of concept. And the whole idea is to launch stuff internationally. I was always curious why the Germans and French were not as successful in exporting technologies or developing new ideas for media. And the reason is they have pretty big domestic markets. So they're kind of, if you can be successful in Germany, well, you're pretty successful. You don't really feel this compelling urge to export. Where smaller countries, if you want to be very successful, you're going to need to design everything from the start for export.
I think there's some schizophrenia in Australia. And part of it is this, everyone says Australia's a small economy. Well, in fact, it's, in the order of 12th largest in the world.
Yeah.
So, and it's 25 million and also fairly rich. And it's, it's a decent sized economy. But it is almost big enough.
Yeah.
So to sustain decent businesses. And part of that schizophrenia as well is that there is some deep conservatism in Australia, wanting to stop immigration, wanting to hold us back, wanting to, just focus on the land and, minerals and so on. And there is also this extraordinarily, all the travelers you mentioned are the ones who are out there exploring, looking for the world, looking to connect. And so you say, well, I'm born, I grew up somewhere which is so far from the rest of the world. Well, I want to go and explore. I want to touch things. I want to move. And so there is this schizophrenia where there's this deeply conservative, stay at home, let's keep other people out type mentality, which is very real. And that was associated with the political party which was in power till the weekend. But there's also this whole dynamic which I think is, come through the centuries of Australians who are just saying, well, we are a long way away. We want to explore, we want to connect, we want to do things. And one of the things I pointed to in the past is Australia actually has been very successful in crowdsourcing platforms. So we've had Freelancer, 99 Designs, Design Crowd, a bunch of the other crowd platforms. And for me, that was always made a lot of sense. Yes, we want to be able to tap global audiences and global markets. We can pull those all together. And that seems to have struck a chord in the ways in which we've been thinking about things. So the mentalities are there, but there is this divided nature to the way Australians think about.
I mean, every country's a little schizophrenic.
Yeah.
One of the things I noticed in Australia is that there's a very, very strong labor movement. It's a pro-labor country, maybe more so than any other place I've visited, where you can say pretty well the labor unions in the United States have been dismantled largely. They're making a comeback right now, but it's tiny, right? In Australia, labor is powerful. And moreover, there's an awareness of labor as an important factor in the economy, and people are conscious of that. And there's a kind of solidarity that comes with that. And so you have a sort of social solidarity. One of the things I noticed that struck me very powerfully back in the 1990s, my very first visits to Australia, was the emphasis on multicultural Australia. This idea that Australia's position on the planet, your geographic location, causes you have no option. You have to embrace the fact that you're based in Asia and deal with that, but also the influx of European immigrants and the immigrants from other parts of the world, that the makeup of Australia was changing. Australia is the first country in the world where I heard the welcome into the land, where people acknowledged that the land was actually the home of an indigenous people. That was new to me. I'd never heard any American try to make some kind of invocation like that. We're starting to hear that all over the world now. That's an idea that I first got purchased in Australia, and it took quite a while for the United States and Canada to catch on. And really, the U.S. is a laggard in that respect. So in some respects, Australians are progressive in ways that we can barely understand in the United States, and we certainly don't have an experience of right now.
Yes. Well, if you look at Northern Europe, those are the socialist capitalist countries, which have really pushed it out in terms of true socialization. Australia is probably more that end of the spectrum it is to the individuality of America. Mm-hmm. Though there's still, again, I think this divide, but certainly yes, there is a strong labor movement. There's socialized medicine. There is this belief that everyone should be supported. There's kind of no question around that. So it's not quite as far as Scandinavian countries in many of those dimensions, but it is, yes, quite strongly social or dare I use the word communal in terms of thinking about the common benefit here, despite the political divides.
I mean, that's a way to think about the future, right? That's a way to construct a future. I bring that up because here in California, where I'm based, the futurist debate is very much dominated by libertarians. And these are people who, if you gave them a choice, there would be no government. They're not anarchists, but they are very distinctly people who are pro-small government, like the less government, the better. And there's merits to their perspectives, so it's worth listening to that perspective. I hear it all the time. It's unavoidable in cryptocurrency and in the Web3 space because it's kind of the dominant strain of the folks that are there. But that is a vision that does not have a lot of room or compassion for people who are disabled or differently able,
right,
people who are older, or people who are not as adept, or people who need a little bit of help, and so forth. And you see that represented in cryptocurrency, where it's like, if your MetaMask wallet gets hacked and you lose all your coins, like, tough luck, you should have took better precautions and so forth. There's like very little sympathy there, very little empathy for people who might not be as adept at that particular thing. And from my viewpoint, that's a pretty cold future. And that's a dominant strain here in California. And those folks speak with a very loud voice. It's not hard to find examples of that. Certainly you can see, Peter Thiel has been at the very forefront. He's very outspoken, but even Elon Musk is starting to move in that direction in his public commentary.
The problem with that view, I think, and Ross, you jump in as well. But if you look at the problems we have to tackle in the future, particularly, the role of human capital and human labor in society as artificial intelligence makes impact, and the impact of climate change, you can't essentially have that view of the world, because the humanitarian cost will be so great if we don't provide some sort of support system or safety net, that it's just unconscionable. It's not something that we as a human species should ever, I think, go down that path. Like, just look at food scarcity. We're talking about that at the moment, but obviously we're at just the start of the worst elements of the climate change in respect to food scarcity and eco refugees, where the estimates are anywhere from 300 million to 1.6 billion eco refugees by 2050. The scale of that requires a much more cohesive community approach. Sorry,
absolutely.
go ahead, Ross.
And yeah, absolutely. And the themes of your book, Techno-Socialism, I think are very highly aligned with that. But I mean, just, I suppose, complementing or pulling out some of those. One of them is that we live in a networked world. And in a networked world, or if you have scale-free networks, you have power law distributions apply. So essentially, as we move to a more networked society, this actually is a force of polarization by its nature. Even if we are getting, even if we are getting everyone who is participating in the networked economy, within them there are going to be, by its very nature, these distributions which pull people apart. So this means that we are moving into a more polarization. These are the fundamental forces, and we need to do everything possible to guard against that. And that requires, essentially, as you pointed out, Brett, we have more and more abundance through technology. So we need to find ways where everyone can benefit from this. And whereas I don't fully subscribe to the view that we start to get massive technological unemployment, there are these risks of certainly underemployment. And so we need to be able to find ways to, be that through universal basic income or other ways to be able to have people participate. And part of the case to make is that if you are wealthy on the better end of the spectrum, do you want a world which is conceivable where people are around with pitchforks and trying to burn your place down? Or do you want people where most people are living happy lives and you can live a happy life too?
Exactly. This is reminds me of a quote from Oliver Wendell Holmes, who said, "I don't mind paying taxes because with them I buy civilization." And that's a nice way to think about it, right? It's all the stuff that makes life okay. It makes it safe to go out in the street and so forth. You don't have to have private security. That's what we're getting with taxes. But now we're talking about the future. We're talking a little bit about forecasting, Ross. And I want to shift the subject to that because this is the heart of our podcast. We're interested in forecasting methodologies. Recently, we had a conversation where I was a little bit surprised because we spoke to someone we have a great respect for who kind of blithely said, you don't have to put any dates on a forecast. You can be a futurist without putting a date on a forecast. And it kind of stuck in my head. And afterwards, I thought about that. And I said, what good is a forecast without a date? And just to put that in perspective, anyone who's an entrepreneur, and I know you're an entrepreneur, Ross, anyone who's an entrepreneur puts their money on the line because they're making a bet on a date every single time. They're saying, I'm going to invest money right now because I think this is the moment in time where it's going to change. Things are going to be different and there'll be a new demand, a future demand for this new product or service that I'm making. And so it seems like a cop-out to not put a date on a forecast. Sorry to editorialize there, but why don't you guys respond to that? And then we can get into like the general topic of the quality of futurists in general.
Well, I mean, firstly, I have to say that I don't actually make many forecasts at all. Mm-hmm. So I do make some dated forecasts, but usually I don't, because I mean, when people say, "What's a futurist?" My role is that my answer is someone who helps people to think, people in organizations to think better about the future so they can act better today. And so it is that process of enriching thinking. That's my job. Is not so much to say, "Hey, I think this is going to happen," either believe me or don't. It is to help people, leaders, and others for themselves to have richer thinking, to think about things they didn't think about otherwise, and so that they can be better equipped to make their own decisions about the future. Mm-hmm. So I don't believe you can outsource. Everyone has to be their own futurist. You can't outsource being the futurist. I mean, in which case the role of the futurist is not say, "Well, this is what I think." Then you can say, "Well, all right, I'm going to believe you. I'm going to put all my eggs because I think you're wonderful, and I'll do everything you say," or "I don't believe you," in which case, there's no use at all. So I think it's most useful to engage and to enrich and to think. But sometimes that is through giving dated predictions, which I did, for example, in my newspaper timeline extinction framework, where I had lots of dates, some of which have got very wrong, some of which I think are going to be pretty spot on, and I've got a lot of pushback from it on various guises. But it made people think, saying,
and it made
is he right? Is he
it,
wrong?
Right? Yeah.
And they started to engage in saying, well, all right, when am I going to turn off my printing presses? And they weren't going to be thinking about that unless I was actually giving those dates. So,
yeah, that's exactly to make it actionable for other people. There has to be a date to it, and I don't mind being wrong, because being wrong is enlightenment. That's how we learn, right? That's where information comes from. That's you learn something in the process.
So Ross, you have famously, in fact, we've used your list of futurists to look at target futurists we should have on this show. You have on rossdawson.com a ranking of the top 200 or so futurists. Tell us about the methodology used in respect to that. Is it mostly a popularity ranking, or how did you come up with that?
So this is it's algorithmic, well, extremely simple algorithm, and it is based looking at influence. So one of the events I did in Sydney and San Francisco was Future of Influence Summit back in 2009, where I was looking at influence as the emerging currency and economy, and looking at various measures to how it is we can look at influence. And that was one of the startups which I put some investment into initially and didn't come off, called Repute, which was looking to provide a more than digital assessment of reputation in various domains. But in terms of the futures ranking, it's just a very simple algorithm. It is only social influence. It's looking at web traffic, Twitter, and some broader social aggregation, I suppose, activity and engagement on social media. So it is not the best, not the top, not the most wonderful, but simply the ones that get the most engagement digitally, based on just a few measures. But that's still interesting in terms of the reach that these futurists have.
That's like influential futurists.
Yes, digital online influence only. So as I was saying, I was hoping to, in other domains, look at, for example, speaking in terms of books, in terms of media, non-digital media appearances, and so on, to aggregate some of those. But this list is simply just a few digital data points and aggregating those in terms of online influence.
What's your own methodology? We talked a little bit about how you're very open to international influences. You're always seeking to build international connections and get that kind of feedback. But what else do you do to keep your blades sharp, to keep learning about the future?
Part of it is, there's this wonderful, all three of us, we have this wonderful feedback loop where whenever we have a client which engages us, who sometimes, puts us on a plane to some strange parts, and we have conversations and we learn from them. So we are sharing what we have learned, and we learn more by going to a different country, by being in a different industry, to having a conversation with different people. So we're all starting, that's a wonderful part of being, reasonably prominent futurists, is the nature, your work feeds your input.
Yeah.
There's a lot of social, obviously I'm scanning sources all the time, being able to pull those together into frameworks of various kinds, but also trying to have those conversations with interesting people in different domains that, thinking more deeply about specific things than me, that I can actually build up and hone that understanding. But, a lot of my deep dives, when the client says, tell me about this, I go say, all right, well, I know a fair bit. Let me just bring that up to date, or bring some new perspectives, or bring that to bear.
Yeah, I've gone around and done interviews with 30 or 40 people, particularly in a field like healthcare, where I'm not going to be an expert myself, but I know what questions to ask, and I know who to call. So I can start to have a conversation, and then every conversation leads to another person. And pretty quickly, you can distill kind of the general wisdom. I think that's a good approach. That makes sense. Sorry, Brett, I cut you off. What were you about to say?
No, I was saying it sounds like a think tank, but something that I think we all tend to do that. I mean, futurists, one thing I really love about futurists is they tend to be very collaborative. If you go to a futurist and ask them a question about the future, they can't help but give you an opinion or jump into the conversation
and share their reasoning, right? They'll say, here's
exactly.
why, even if it's a debate or like an argument, you get into a very constructive conversation because you start to think about the forces that shape the future. Ross, what do you think the big forces are that shape the future? I have all sorts of theories about that. But I want to hear from you what you think are the big macro trends that are going to determine, kind of define the boundaries around what possible future is available to us in the next 10 years or so.
Well, to take probably a non-traditional approach, it is who we are as humans. When we find out who we become, we've discovered who we are. So if we create a positive future where we float out the stars and we meld our consciousness, then that's who we are as humans. If we destroy ourselves, then we've discovered who we are as humans. Yikes. So that is the fundamental question. The fundamental trend is who are we? And discovering what that is through what we
What's
enact.
the purpose? Yeah.
So where we have got to today is the nature of us as inventors. Humans, we always say, I want to do this better. I want to make things. I'm ambitious. I want to, create a better way of doing things. And that's the history of who we've become. And so there are fraught implications of that. We've created some deep challenges for us in that process. And so there is this divide between, can we, through this techno-utopianism perspective and saying, well, we're brilliant, we can solve all the problems we've created, possibly, or that we are the deep divisions within us. So in terms of thinking about the future, I think it's ultimately saying, who are we? And how will we express ourselves collectively? And critically, are we evolving? And that's, in fact, the next phase of my work, is looking at, can we evolve both in terms of our cognition, of our ways of thinking, and morally?
And philosophically, that leads us to a great way to sort of finish this out. We tend to do this on each of the episodes now, is looking out over the next 30 to 50 years, Ross. What excites you about the future? What captures your imagination? Futurists tend to be in a hurry to get to the future. What would you really like to see happen in the future?
A big part of my focus is human-machine integration, synthesis, symbiosis, where our brains, which are, if we look at the entire universe, the most extraordinary phenomenon in the entire universe is the human brain by many orders of magnitude. It is just mind-boggling. We understand the depths of the universe. We go down to these quarks and these microparticles, yet we actually have a pretty limited understanding of our brain. That's the real frontiers. So if we can merge not just our human brain and its extraordinary capabilities with the technologies that we create, be they artificial general intelligence or whatever it is that we can do with technologies, and bringing those together and potentially being able to merge human consciousness and human thinking, direct human to human brain communication. So of course, many challenges and many potential problems from all of this, but that is truly exciting, where I can tap through my mind just to access all of the information available, offload different cognitive processes, to use that to be able to think more effectively about the future, about my relationships, and as well to be able to connect more directly to someone else's brain, be that a lover or be that someone I'm trying to have a complex political debate with.
Interesting.
A few years ago, there was an event in South Australia, in Adelaide, where I wanted to bring you in, and unfortunately it didn't work out for that particular event. But one of the speakers that I really wanted you to meet was Dr. Philip Alvelda. And he was the researcher at DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects at the Pentagon in the U.S., our Defense Department, who developed that cortical modem, the brain interface for the computer. And he was talking about many of these things. It wasn't just what happens to people when they can connect to the network, but it's also what happens to the machines. And he actually, since that time, has gone and launched companies because he said, look, we're going to need new computing architectures and new languages for computers so that they can understand and communicate with us better. So he's focused on that. We'll have him on a show in the future, but I do want to make that connection with you at some point because I know
Please.
you two will, you'll get along very, very well.
So, Ross, how can people find out more about the work you're doing? And, of course, you've got a new book coming out, Thriving on Overload. We hope to get you back on the show to talk about that when it comes out. But where can people find more about yourself and what you're working on?
It's pretty easy, rossdawson.com on the web, or Ross Dawson on Twitter, or Ross Dawson on LinkedIn. And yes, new book coming out, Thriving on Overload. You can go to thrivingonoverload.com, and they've got a podcast on there as well, talking to amongst other people about how to thrive on overload in a world of information overload, how to make sense of it. So that's another resource.
Wow, great. Well, Ross Dawson, great to have you on the show, man. Thanks.
Like every episode lately, it feels like we've only just touched the surface, and we could go on for much longer. But thank you for joining us, and all the way from Australia. And stay healthy and stay positive. That's it for the Futurists this week. We will be back next week, of course, with more great future discussions and taking into the future. And don't forget to leave us a review. If you've listened to the podcast, a 5-star review, wherever it is you download the podcast. Don't forget to share it on social media, help others to find it. All of that will be super helpful. And Robert and I will be very grateful for any assistance there to get some traction. But until then, we will see you
in the future. Well, that's it for the Futurists this week. If you like the show, we sure hope you did. Please subscribe and share it with the people in your community. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. That really helps other people find the show. And you can ping us anytime on Instagram and Twitter at Futurist Podcast for the folks that you'd like to see on the show or the questions that you'd like us to ask. Thanks for joining. And as always, we'll see you in the future.